Say anything. I talk mainly about what our next guest, Pat Toomey, United States Senator from Pennsylvania, has been suggesting since after the days after Newtown. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. It's got to be something to go from being called a squish for going too far on background checks one day to being called a squish for not going far enough by the President of the United States. Let me ask, are you and Joe Manchin going to push this bill forward and consider adding the portion that raises the gun buying age to 21? So
the answer is Joe Manchin and I are definitely going to move forward if we can. We are actively soliciting the support for our bill. There are several Republican senators who voted against it in 2013 who have told me they are reconsidering. So I am hopeful about that. I think the president's very aggressive support for expanding background checks is encouraging. As you know, that's the centerpiece of our legislation. And then, look, I think we ought to, if we could get to a consensus, get to where we think we've got 60 votes on something like Manchin-Toomey, then let's put it on the Senate floor, and then let's have lots of amendments, and everybody can have their idea litigated and let the Senate work its will.
You know, Senator, last time I think about 9 in 10 Americans supported your bill when you put it out, universal background checks on gun purchases. It still couldn't get a vote. Now, though, you've got polls anywhere from 87% to one I saw last week, 97% of Americans supporting universal background checks on all gun purchases. Do you think that just the realities that Walmart's seeing and that FedEx is seeing and that Delta's seeing and that Dick's Sporting Goods is seeing, do you think that eventually congressmen and senators will feel the same pressure to listen to what 90% of Americans want?
Well, I hope so. And let me be clear, the Manchin-Toomey bill is not completely universal. It does close the gun show loophole and internet sales, but personal transaction between friends, for instance, would not be subject. Can have a discussion about how far that should go, but it definitely broadens background checks very substantially and would cover the vast, overwhelming majority of sales. I do think something has changed, right? We're certainly seeing it when large retailers decide that they're going to change their practices. So I hope that will get a consensus within Congress to do so. You're exactly right. Look, Pennsylvania is a big Second Amendment state. Lots of folks own guns and have for generations. They don't think that it's an infringement on the Second Amendment to do a 3-minute background check to screen out the people who are dangerously mentally ill or violent criminals. We ought to respond to that.
Senator Toomey, it's Willie Geist in New York. My question for you, and you faced this uphill battle since you first introduced Manchin-Toomey all those years ago, and you had your NRA rating dropped. I think it was to a C at the time.
Sounds right.
What is the resistance to this idea you're talking about? In other words, who are the people that are preventing this from moving forward? The idea, I think, sounds common sense to a lot of people, that there ought to be a background check even on private sales, even on a sale at a gun show. What's standing in the way of that happening?
Well, I'll tell you, I think back in 2013, the argument that I heard the most was, well, first of all, people, much of it was misrepresented. When they got to the facts, they didn't actually oppose the substance of our bill, but they said, but it's a slippery slope. And we know that President Obama really would like to ban whole categories of guns and take away our guns, so we shouldn't be moving in that direction. Nobody thinks that Donald Trump is going to come in and try to ban whole categories of guns or confiscate guns. So I think that might change the dynamic somewhat as well. But look, it was a very small percentage of people who think it's a bad idea to do a background check.
Were you shocked, Senator, by some of the things you heard from the president yesterday, including the elimination in some cases of due process, take the gun first, due process later, raising the age to 21 to be able to purchase a weapon, floated the idea we ought to have a discussion of an assault weapons ban? Were you surprised by what you heard from the president?
Well, look, I have to admit that the idea of taking a person's property before the due process, that did take my breath away a little bit. It doesn't work that way in America. But look, I think there's an old saying about this president, which is take him seriously, not necessarily literally. And I think the big takeaway from this meeting is he wants to get something done. The broadening background checks would be the centerpiece of it. And you know, we ought to consider a whole range of other items. So I agree with that. I agree with all of that. Individual items that some of my colleagues will offer as amendments, I'll vote against. Some I'd probably vote for. Let's have that debate. Let's let the Senate function. Let the American people see this process. And I think in the end, we'd have a product.
Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, thank you as always for your time. We appreciate it. Let's bring in another lawmaker.